Hey everybody, my name is Ben Lieb, and a lot of people have been asking me in the comments of my videos just how I got my start in tech. I'm just kidding, I only have like 20 subscribers and no one's made a comment yet in any of my videos, but I thought it would be interesting for anyone out there who's thinking about getting into the tech world, or who's curious about how some of the older folks that are currently in the tech world got into the tech world and the programming world, and the various circuitous routes we might have taken, since when I got my start it was, I don't want to say not an active field, but it was definitely not the field that it is today, where you can go to school for web development or go to school for programming and that kind of thing. The way that I encountered it was very circuitously. So I just thought I'd talk a little bit about that today and see if I can get the story out. If this video ends up like actually working, because I'm pretty new at this, then maybe I'll keep it. And if it doesn't, then I'll tell the story tomorrow or another day. Anyway, so let's see. I am currently 47. The year is 2022. And I went to school at Virginia Tech for electrical engineering in 1993. I thought I wanted to be an inventor. And I asked my high school physics teacher if I could go to school to be an inventor, and he said, not really, but you can go to school for engineering, which is pretty close. So that sounded cool to me. But when I got into school and into the engineering classes, a lot of the people in those classes just didn't really make sense to me. I didn't really connect with them. They weren't, for better or for lack of a better term, they weren't my people. They were pretty dry, they were pretty stiff, they were pretty, in my opinion at the time, a bit uncreative and very nuts and bolts kind of people. So I quickly determined for myself that engineering isn't really what I was interested in. But I was interested in a lot of other things at the time: learning languages, traveling around, doing artistic projects, that kind of thing. So I went into biology, and then I went into chemistry and didn't quite find it. But eventually I graduated undergrad with a degree in French and a degree in linguistics, or degree in English with a concentration in linguistics. So that's how that went down. Around my last year of college, I took, in the literature department, there was a class offered by a gentleman who was teaching classes in the computer science department and in the English department. And he had these strange kind of crossover classes. And he offered a class called hypertext literature, and this must have been in 1996 or 7. And I don't remember even knowing what that meant, but something told me it was interesting to me. I looked at the description. It talked about, writing computer code or something, and making books that were nonlinear and reading books that were nonlinear, something like that. So I got into this class, and this was when HTML was quite young. I don't even know if there were tables. There probably were tables, HTML tables. But so this gentleman had us reading books that were on CDs. And I don't know if they were DVDs. Anyway, the literature was stories, but they were non-linear. It was just a page of text, and a bunch of the words in the text were linked to other places in the document. So it was just like a web. It's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure novel that you're never really sure when you finished it, and you're never really sure how to get back to where you were the last time you read it. So you're just kind of jumping around, and in the end, it was pretty frustrating experience to read this as literature, but it was very clear to me that the technology was powerful. And so one of our projects was to write our own like story using hypertext as the format. So we hand coded these stories, and then we put little links to other pages of our novel, or our short story. It wasn't a novel, definitely was not a novel. And I wrote a really awful story about someone working in a wood shop and piano falling on his head or something. I don't remember. But what I do remember is spending a lot of time thinking through the links and understanding the technology and understanding my editor and all of this kind of stuff. I was kind of taken with this. So the hypertext document. And I was also kind of getting more interested in ecology and making sure the planet was healthy and not wasting paper, and buying ink cartridges and all of that kind of thing. So I said, why don't I do everything for school as a digital document? Seemed right to me. But for other classes that had me submit papers, I just handed them a disc, a 3x5. I think we called it floppy, but it wasn't floppy. 3x5 disc, not the big floppy 5-inch ones or whatever those were. Anyway, so I would do that, and my professors just didn't quite know what to do with that, and it was kind of unsafe at the time because there were these viruses you can get, I guess, from people's disk drives. But I started doing everything like that, digitally and not with paper, and it just kind of, it made sense to me that that's where the world was going. So yeah, that's probably the very, very beginning of my introduction to the web. I could say more about that, but gosh, it's going to be a long video if I keep doing that. So I think the next, probably the next pivotal moment was the old time music and dance community in Blacksburg, Virginia, where Virginia Tech is, where I went to school. I had met some people in that community who were just really inspiring people, very supportive, and ended up being mentors to me. And one of them, by the name of Phil Lauer, I guess looking back, he probably saved my life, given that I was somewhat depressive and somewhat confused and lost and didn't have much of a purpose. But he started taking me to music events and dance events, and he had a little side business fronting gem carvers. And seems a bit random at this point looking back, but yes, he loved gems and gemstones, and he still does, because he's still with us, thank goodness. I don't get to see him very much at all, but that's a different story. So Phil ended up running a group called the Hoorah Cloggers. He was pretty instrumental in maintaining it over the decades after kind of the swell went down of interest after the 70s, 80s, 90s. So towards the end of the 90s, I became interested in that, and so he had me kind of helping with the organization, and he asked me to make some flyers, asked me to make some business cards, and I even made a website for the Hoorah Cloggers way back in the day, which is probably still online, hoorahcloggers.org or .com, and haven't touched it in decades, but it's probably still there, I don't know. Right, so he asked me to make these flyers, so I tried to figure out how to make a flyer, and I went into the media center in Virginia Tech because not everyone had that kind of computer at their disposal and those programs. So I found an early version of Photoshop, which was really, really frustrating to use, but really powerful. I remember I couldn't figure out how to flatten the image to get it printed. It kept printing out in Photoshop format or something. Anyway, so I started messing around with graphics, and then one thing led to another. Phil actually started asking me to do more and more and more, and I guess I was doing it okay, enough that he hired me to help out with the gem carvers, and he asked me to take photographs of these very difficult to photograph sculptures and figurines and jewelry and all of these gem art related objects. It was pretty difficult. I didn't know anything about photography, but he bought me the cameras, and I figured out how to get light filters and all that stuff going. And I promise this is gonna kind of tie into how the heck I've recently been, as an engineering manager at a company in Berkeley for the last several years. But this is kind of the route it took me. And so I started taking pictures of these gem artworks and putting them up on a website, NorthAmericanGemCarvers.com. That's probably also still there, and haven't touched that in decades either. So I kind of learned my way around the web, and then I learned my way around photography and that kind of thing. But I was still very much interested in linguistics and language education and language learning, and some other peripheral interests. So at some point I ended up leaving that area to do Peace Corps work in China, and then I danced with a group called Footworks, percussive dance group up in Annapolis, Maryland. And when I left that group, I ended up going back to school to teach language, and so this is kind of all going at the same time. And I ended up going down to Ecuador to teach English. I don't know, must have been 2002, I think, is when I graduated with a master's in language education. So I went down there, and I was teaching at this place called the in the, what is it? The experiment in international living, the El Experimento de Convivencia Internacional, or something like that. So they decided to pay me about $3 an hour, and that was a wake up call. I was making about $3 American down there, and I had been making, trying to think back, in 2002. I think I was making $20-ish an hour doing like little tech-like things, doing website work and photography and that kind of stuff. So I was like, wow, $3 isn't very much. And I had a full course load. I was teaching people English before they went to work and after they went to work. So I was teaching classes around 5 a.m. and then again at like 6 p.m. So, and somewhat during the day, but mostly I had to sleep half of my sleep in the middle of the day and half of my sleep late at night because I kept going out to dance salsa. Anyway, that's a different story. So this company that I work with, the Experiment in International Living, they had a really dysfunctional website, and I just started volunteering to try to help out with it. And the gentleman there who's actually hired to do this, he didn't seem to know all that much about his job, so I kind of helped him. And then he said, "You're really good at this," and I said, "Well, it was pretty simple stuff at the time, but I guess everyone was just getting into it. You know, he did a lateral transfer, and who knows what he was doing before, but he was interested. So we worked on it together, and I was like, this is kind of fun. And then somehow or another, I got some emails from back home, from Virginia, asking me, don't I do that website stuff? And could I help out a friend of theirs or a client of theirs? And so I started getting job offers. And when I heard about the salary they're going to offer me, the hourly wage, it was around $35 an hour. And this is in 2002. And I'm sitting there making $3 an hour, and I was like, man, I could make my whole week's pay working a couple hours doing this stuff remotely. So I'm old school remote. So I was like, man, I talked to my boss, and I dropped down my course load from teaching English, even though I was under contract. And I dropped down to just my two favorite clients, who are both diplomats, and from Ecuadorian diplomats. And yeah, then I started doing some little projects on the side. I don't remember what I was doing, but I was making $35 an hour, and that seemed like it just kind of, I walked right into it, or it walked right into me, and I was like, I guess the writing's on the wall. So I did that for a while, and when I came back from Ecuador to the US, I decided to start my own company making websites, I guess. I guess at that time they called it web design, and that's kind of like this, it's almost like interior design. It's really simple. Of course, most things were pretty simple at that time. It was just a brochure website with some content, some pictures, and you set up your domain and that kind of thing. And then there were some payments, maybe a little bit, something like that. Anyway, so I made myself a website, and I said what I did, I guess you call it hanging up a shingle. So, and I don't know, I can't tell you why, but people started to contact me through my website and offer me work. First, it was kind of like friends of friends who were referred, and then within like a year or two, it started to be people I had never met. And then I proceeded, probably, goodness, to work the next 10 to 15 years as the main, well, the only person really working in this Pixel Earth web technologies is what I called it. So I just had web development work, and my rate just kept going up, and I never met most of the people, at least half the people that I worked with, I never actually met or spoke with in person. It was all, and I had work backed up, I don't know, at least 10 or 15 years. My work was backed up all the time because I didn't really want to work full time. I had other interests, music and dance and travel and languages and just being alive and not sitting behind a computer for my whole life. So this is how that happened. So somehow the hypertext literature class and Phil Lauer asking me to do things that were a little outside of my zone of knowledge that I just learned. And then little known to me, I became useful to people who really needed that particular skill at the time. And it was something I liked to do. So I guess I fell into it. It was not a grand plan. But at that time, 2003 or 4, I decided to move to Asheville, North Carolina, and I started getting more and bigger clients, and I worked with a group called Buncombe County Medical Society. And this was kind of my first big client. It was a big medical society. They must have had 30 odd employees, and they just had all kinds of work for me to do. And I went in, and I don't recall how I met them. I don't recall how. I don't recall anything really. But the woman who was in charge, the director, we got along really well. And I don't remember her name, unfortunately. I'm sorry. You're probably not watching this video anyway. But we just got on well, and she had faith in me, and she just gave me things. And at one point, she walked me into her office, and she said, "Well, we just got our budget for the year for technology. It's $10,000. I'm just going to write you a check for $10,000." And she said, "We'll just work it off. Just keep track of your hours." And I was just like, that was a lot of money to me at the time, and I just couldn't believe that she was so cavalier with it, and it was mine. And yeah, it took me a while to process that. You know, I dressed okay. I sometimes wore a tie when I went in there, and that's another story about how to inspire confidence in people. And for better or for worse, probably for better, and whether I earned it or not earned it or deserved it or not, people felt confident in my work, and they are always, with the exception of one client who, I'm not sure what she did. She had a dog website, and I was too slow, I think. Anyway, with the exception of that one little client, everyone was pretty happy, and then it just kind of went on from there. And I just worked maybe 10 to 20 hours a week, depending on what I was interested in, what else I had going on. But definitely, I did never imagine it would be a full-time thing, and I didn't really at that point understand that it could be a career. Though other people around me did. There was another gentleman working with the Buncombe County Medical Society who was clearly well on his path of entrepreneurship, well before I was anyway, and they asked him to do work, but he negotiated, and I just didn't understand it at the time. This is one of many things that I thought was kind of ludicrous when I first encountered it, only to realize many years later that, wow, there's a lot of intelligence behind that approach. Anyway, they would ask him to do things, and he said, "Well, I'll do it for you, but I want to own it, and I will lease it to you under a license that you get to use." And then turns out it was complicated. I was like, wow, that's really complicated. But then he would lease the same thing he built for them to other companies, other medical societies or whatever it was. It was CRMs. And anyhow, he became the owner of his product, and he probably continued to develop things. But at the time, it didn't make much sense to me. They asked me to build an interpreter network. Actually, one of the people there said, "Do you know anyone who knows anything about interpreting and could build us a web application?" And I was like, well, I did medical interpreting for 4 years at the hospital in Asheville, and I do this kind of thing. It was a little bit of a stretch because it was going to be more advanced work than I'd ever done. And the technology at the time wasn't what it is now. There weren't really great web development frameworks, and I had to write my own object relational mapper for the MySQL database in PHP, and there was something called a pair repository that nothing. Anyway, it was a different world. You had to make everything yourself. And so they gave me the job. I made this interpreter network that seemed to do pretty good, and just got more and more. They started making money off my thing, and I started to realize, wow, I made this thing for other people. Maybe I should make myself something one day. But it was just like an inkling. It was just a little spark in the back of my head. So it was years later, and I'm actually going to make some videos on my first several kind of passive income generating websites. If I remember, I'll put the link here or the video here, though I've never done that yet, and I don't know how to do it. But so I made this thing, the interpreter network, and let's see what was my next step. Yeah, I was just kind of going from, dentists started hiring me, and architects started hiring me, and just random entrepreneurs started hiring me, some guy who worked on the stock market, and I thought I was doing great, and I was. My rate slowly went up. I think at that time, I know it's a little sensitive to talk about money, but just so people know that in probably 2005, 6, 7, I was making probably $60, $70, maybe up to 80 sometimes dollars an hour. And that seemed like a good deal for me, and I didn't have to work very much, and I just made enough money to live my life. Didn't know anything about the stock market, didn't realize I was missing some opportunities there with time value of money in the market. Anyway, that's a separate story. But Yeah, so it turns out that many of these entrepreneurs, I could have had a much more intelligent relationship with them and built something with them where I had some skin in the game, and I had more access to the actual income. But most of them actually weren't great entrepreneurs, with the exception of that stock market guy. Most of their projects kind of like went flat, and that's probably because they didn't hire a person who really knew business. They hired me, and I was learning, and they didn't ask me to be a business consultant, but they could have used one. Anyway, so I learned kind of this way, and then a friend of mine, I was working in Perl originally, then I was working in PHP for a long time, and I have this friend of mine, Bruce Hallman, who is a very interesting fellow. I haven't seen him very much. He's in Canada now. Anyway, he was always interested in like the new tech things, and I didn't really know this in detail, but one day he talked to me about this thing called Ruby on Rails. And he started describing it, and I was like, I can't make sense of what you're talking about. You're using the command line to build your website, what? So he said, why don't you come over to my house and I'll show you. And so I go over to his house, he shows me this beautiful table he made, and then he shows me his cool computer workstation, much cooler than mine. And then he's like, so, look, I'm gonna make a new website. And he goes to his command line, and then he writes I know the commands now, but he writes a command, and poof, all these files get generated. I was like, I just made like 60 files that are gonna run your website. He said, yeah, I'm gonna watch this. I'm gonna write this thing that'll interact with the database to make a whole scaffold. And he like, and he has code that interacts with the database, sticks stuff in the database. And I was like, this is crazy. This is changing my life. It's one of at least 10, I'd say 10-minute periods that completely changed the direction of my life. That'd be an interesting video to make too, all these other ones. But anyway, so Bruce talked to me about this, and I was like, oh wow, that's mine. I'm gonna learn about that. So I don't know, read some books, got good at it, and then I switched from that point on to using that particular framework, and I was, I don't know, easily 50 times more productive than I'd ever been. And it was just like, if you ever seen The Matrix, at the end they're in these big metal human things, and they're like, there's a little guy sitting up front with the levers, and so it felt like to be working with Rails. I was like inside this huge machine yanking little levers, and it was like problems smashed. Anyway, so it was Bruce Hallman again that maybe in a couple of years later, we were having lunch one day, and he was talking about, maybe I'm gonna move, maybe I should go out to San Francisco. Everyone says I should go out to San Francisco, but maybe I'll just do my own thing. And he mentioned this word. He said, I don't need to go now, but it's clear that I'm sitting on a golden ticket. And I didn't quite know what he meant by golden ticket immediately, but then I was like, oh, golden ticket. And then I stopped hearing anything he said once I understood, well, not everything, but I was like, am I sitting on a golden ticket? I don't know if I'm sitting on a golden ticket. I had never thought about it, but over the next couple of years, it became clear that there was what I had entered as a kind of stumbled into and kind of went in through the back door or the side door. I was not trained in programming. I was not trained in algorithm development or database. I just read books and learned online and convinced people to give me their money. Apparently, it didn't really feel like that. They came to me. They needed a thing, but it turns out that there was a proper industry forming for the last previous 10 years at the time, and they had standards, they had norms, they had big clients. We're talking about Facebook and Google and AWS and Apple and all these small things that were just starting to come out at the time. And I was like, maybe I have a golden ticket. And that kind of like stuck in my head for a while. And then there's a whole lot of interpersonal life stuff that happened. But at some point in the next several years, I was like, I think I should go to San Francisco and just see what's there. I'd never been interested in working at a big company. I always wanted my freedom. I always wanted my flexibility. And the funny thing about the next part, and I should probably stop talking. I've got a friend coming over. But I didn't know that people trained for years and studied and prepared for tech interviews. I had always gone into interviews with my potential clients just like as peers. We talk about the problem, I talk about how I'd approach it. If they have confidence in me, we sign a contract and we get going. I didn't know people understand they had to work on the soft skills and the hard skills, and then the problem solving and the algorithm side, and then there's the the HR interview and then the CEO interview or whatever. I had no clue. I think looking back, I was definitely overconfident. I felt confident. I don't know if I should have felt confident, but I just didn't know. I didn't know any better. So I went down, I stayed with some friends I'd met at a dance convention for a couple weeks. And I just went around to companies who were hiring and applied. I applied and they asked me to come in, and I'd say 5 or 6 companies had me come, no, 3 or 4, about 4 or 5 companies had me come in, talk to them. And they had to do coding things, and I had no idea what I was doing, but for some reason I came out of that 2 weeks with 2 offers, and 2 like low six figure offers, and I just didn't really understand what had happened, and I was mostly dreading the fact that my life wasn't going to be my own anymore. So as soon as I said, oh, I should really take this offer, or one of these offers, I'm not going to say who they were with. Yeah, well, one was the Public Library of Science, and one was a company called Verbling, a language education company. So the first thing I thought was, I better have some fun before I have to sit behind a desk and work on a team or whatever. So I said yes, I'd like to accept. I accepted the Public Library of Science offer as a senior engineer. My first job in the actual tech scene. I got a senior position, and I guess that was right. I had no idea about any of that at the time. But I decided I wanted to go to Taiwan. I had always wanted to go to Taiwan, and so I said, I can start in a month. And that night, I bought a ticket to Taiwan. And so I went there, hung out in Taiwan, and then when I came back, I moved my stuff down from Portland, Oregon, where I was, and started working at this Public Library of Science. And to kind of close this story up, I was working on high level stuff at the time. That we had a team of 15 engineers. There were 2 graphic designers. There was 2 project managers. There was not engineers, but 15, maybe 15 engineers. There was we were all full stack. We were working on an Ember front end and a Ruby on Rails back end. I think it was Postgres database. Anyway, it was complicated. It was actually really, really hard. It was easy to start because we were making this huge I don't know. It was a scientific paper publishing platform because the Public Library of Science publishes scientific papers. So the hard part wasn't the work. The hard part was keeping up with everyone else's work. There were so many engineers, and it was moving so fast that you get to work, and the first hour is spent trying to figure out what everyone else did at the end of the day after you left. You had to do code reviews and read all the code and figure out if they changed any of your code. And then you start to work on your own feature. You had a stand-up meeting. You start to work on your own feature. Then you push your feature maybe a couple hours later, and there's 20 conflicts because 15 other people had pushed stuff. And then so you go, have to integrate their work, and then you fix your conflicts and you push it up. And in the intervening time, there was 6 conflicts because people pushed their work. It was constantly conflict, and that's because we were all full stack people. We were all doing the same problems, and in my opinion, anyway, this is kind of a divergence, or what do you call it, a tangent. But I think we should have specialized in certain areas so that we were not stepping all over each other. It was just I got really frustrated with it, and I did end up leaving because my work definitely suffered because I was unhappy at towards the end. Anyway, so I worked for this Public Library of Science, and I ended that job. I went back to Taiwan because I liked Taiwan so much. But I started applying for jobs at some point, and then I worked for a group called Chatterbug, which is a language education company started by the founders of GitHub. They had sold to Microsoft, and I didn't know who they were really at the time, but I was in the presence of tech royalty. They're good folks, but I didn't really know who they were. I should have done my homework, but I did. I learned later. I'll spare some of my personal embarrassing stories. I don't think they felt embarrassed, but they may have felt embarrassed for me. I was like, "What have you done in the past?" And they mentioned things that no one had heard of, even though these guys created one of the most used open source platforms. It revolutionized all of humanity's ability to collaborate on code together. They didn't say, but after about six months, I realized, oh. Anyway, So I work with Chatterbug, and then they let me go because they're moving their stuff to Berlin after about a year. They tried to keep me on, but it was the time zone was hard, and everyone else was in Berlin, and they're paying me more than everyone they had to pay in Berlin. And long story short, that lasted about a year. And anyway, my next job started off as a contract thing that led me into doing more and more work, and I became a lead of a team and had some junior people under me and a designer under me. And then, long story short, I ended up taking the person who had been in charge of the engineering team, the small engineering team, ended up stepping back through some external pressure and some internal emotional dynamics, I think. Anyway, so here I found myself like leading a small engineering team responsible for the internal systems, all the data, all the payments, all of the design work, all the code reviews, all of the new development, the new features. And that kind of takes us full circle. That was what my last job was, and it was well compensated, and it was, on the top, it wasn't like a huge tech company, it was a travel company. But so somehow I ended up from a hypertext literature class in college, and like doing flyers for the square dance and the cloggers, to managing an engineering team with no actual formal education. And the mind reels, I suppose, to figure out, to make sense of that trajectory, and to I'm just processing it right now. I just thought I would sit down and talk about this as if I knew everything about what it meant. But yeah, I think everyone's path is circuitous, and it was definitely not I knew what I wanted to do in high school. To be honest, the stuff I do now didn't exist, couldn't have been imagined when I was in high school. So my big idea was I wanted to travel the world teaching and learning languages. That's what I wanted to do in high school. Well, actually, I wanted to be a soccer player, but anyway, long story short, I worked for this company for about 4.5 years, and it became kind of emotionally, psychologically straining to the point that I really did need to resign. And so right as I was about ready to resign, they offered me a severance, and they were ready to make some changes and not have an in-house engineering team. And so I graciously was offered a 4-month severance when I was about to resign anyway. So thank you, Nicole. Very, very generous. Maybe she knew. I don't know. But yeah, so I have this 4-month period. I'm probably three months into this 4-month severance period where things are taken care of. I have income from the last project I was in, and I'm trying to reevaluate what's next. The programming world is there's a need. It's well compensated, but you often, if you work at these bigger companies, you have a really rigid lifestyle. Certain hours you have to be at your desk, working, communicating, and there's a lot of responsibility involved. And I do really miss the days where I could just shape my days the way I saw fit, travel the way I saw fit, and just have my own projects. So these days I think a lot about that, the entrepreneurial side of things, and how I can build my own tools that provide me with a certain type of income and provide other people with a certain type of value. And I have some experience with that, but I don't know if that's the direction I'm going to go in. But I've had several months to just kind of explore my heart and like what feels like motivating to me, inspiring to me, what fills me with this sense of awe and interest and excitement. And to be honest, right now, programming, and it's not really that. Not programming for someone else, though I probably will do that for a little bit. But I'm making this video, and that points to one of the things that is the most real to me, and that's content creation, education through content creation. It does feel very inspiring to me. I'm not sure what form that's going to take, but making videos for a purpose and for an audience, a very specific audience, whether that's tech education or music education, or interviewing people to understand their deeper inner workings. And I have a lot of ideas. It is kind of a flexion point, I think, for me, after having been in that world that kind of just swept me up. And I'm reconnecting with dances and music, groups and musical instruments that I had kind of let lie a bit fallow. I was still doing music and dance, but wasn't really able to be a focus for me like it had been in the past. And I think I did end up feeling a bit unmoored, maybe even like I fell off the boat of the life that gave me passion, it gave me excitement. So that's what's next, and content creation might be part of that. So if you're looking at this in 10 years after I've made this video, maybe you're also looking at some interesting content that I made. I have no clue. Right now I've made 3 YouTube videos on little teeny tech subjects, and it's just to kind of dip my toe in and press the record button and see what happens. And yeah, I have equipment now. I have lighting stands. I have umbrellas. You can't see how perfectly lit I am. No, I have a little light right there with an umbrella, and I got these little lights behind me because that's what all the cool YouTubers do. Anyway, so I'm trying to figure out if you have advice for me or comments, please, if they're nice comments, yeah, maybe leave a comment. And if you want me to clarify any of the points that I've talked about, let me know that too, and maybe I'll do a follow-up. All right, thank you very much. Talk to you later.